Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal and you are watching the second dispatch in our series of thought leadership conversations with Sri Lamarchand Mangaldas. We are joined today by Mr. Cyril Shroff, the managing partner at the firm. Also joining him is Amita Katragara, partner at the firm. Amita and Mr. Shroff, thank you for joining us. The topic for today's discussion is a pertinent one, navigating the governance curve. It's an interesting topic as governance has assumed a significant color and importance in the pandemic. These are unprecedented times, to say the least, and especially what a time to be a director of a public company. Weekly huddles via video chat and incomplete information decks that can only be digitally accessed through secure networks. Perhaps gone are the days of scheduled board meeting just once in a quarter with detailed agenda papers rapidly delivered in advance. In our last conversation with Mr. Shroff, we were actually talking about developing a new skill set for the deal makers to establish trust in synthetic environments. Perhaps there are new realities which these directors at the board of companies also need to be grappled with. While these are one set of new realities, we also have the changing nature of the disclosures. During the pandemic and the recovery, disclosures are likely to become increasingly stakeholder centric. While EESG, which really stands for employee, environmental, social, and governance disclosures, generally have been presented separately with financial disclosures, the pandemic has blurred the line between the two set of issues. In my conversation with a very interesting and a very distinguished panel today for the next 1 hour, we'd like to deep dive into some of these topics. For the purpose of clarity, we have structured the conversation to three parts. The first part really will talk about the current assessment coming out of COVID-19. I will start with you, Mr. Shroff. If given the context of the conversation that I really established, if you could perhaps tell me what is the thinking pattern of board directors right now? Give us some color. How are they thinking through this?
Thank you, Shrija, and pleasure to be back again. I really enjoyed our last interaction as well, and
Absolutely.
once again, I think we are dealing with an extremely important topic, which has long-term implications. Because what we are going through at this moment, universally, is unprecedented. It's universal in terms of its impact, and it is not possible that the framework of governance that we have seen in the past will not go through a very fundamental change. The entire trajectory of the conversation is about to change. I think the few initial changes of direction have happened, but we will see the impact of the trajectory change become more and more evident as time passes by, and the real impact of this sort of comes to bear. It's like when there is an earthquake under an ocean, it takes a few moments before the tsunami hits the shore. So we are in that interim phase where the earthquake has happened and the tsunami wave is sort of building up, and it will hit the floor with that timeline. We are in
It's
that
very well
interim
put.
period.
Yeah.
That's what I think is happening. So, as you rightly said, we are discussing this in three parts, and I think the best way to start is to talk about firstly what is the current assessment. So, again, without disrespect to any boards, I think it's in three phases. If you were to look at the past, I think boards were largely fast asleep. Then, in the initial phases of the crisis, probably in the March April time frame, they started running around like headless chickens. So they were awake, but they were headless chicken. And what we're seeing now is a gradual awakening. So I think the dust is settling. They've sort of taken stock. So initially it was a bit more of rabbit in the headlights kind of syndrome, but at this point now, the conscientious boards or those who are kind of more thoughtful are finding their feet, and they're grappling with some of the real issues. And they have, I think, created a cascade of priorities as well of how to deal with it. So first and foremost, this is a health crisis. So most boards are first and foremost worried and are taking care of the health of their health and safety of their employees, and also of their supply chain, because it's not just your employees, but every business entity has an implication on a wider sort of ecosystem of both customers and suppliers. So many of the businesses are thinking about the implications on the entire chain. So first, I think the health and safety crisis. The second, I think they're dealing with other forms of risk assessments as well. So given the impact of this crisis on stock market prices and this competitive vulnerabilities, many of them are also thinking about what if I had a hostile takeover, and what about my share price? So even if you see some of the initiatives on relisting or take private, how do you insulate yourself from the change in corporate culture? So that's another sort of survival related governance that is taking shape. The third relates to raising finance. So I think there's a general common sense mantra of cash is king. So there are 4 or 5 mantras which got, but the one right at the top is cash is king. And therefore, how do you tank up on capital? Do I go to the equity markets with a QIP or a rights issue? Do I draw down on lines of credit? What would be the terms of it? So that's another theme that is occupying the attention of boards. So every board conversation has definitely an element of how do we tank up on cash. The other change which we're seeing in the current context is the fact that there was the earlier distinction between the executive and the non-executive directors, or the promoter directors and the other directors. Some of these changes are getting blurred. So the word non-executive directions is kind of becoming a bit silent now. So you, instead of, as you in your introductory remarks said, quarterly meetings, around the boardroom with lots of cashew nuts. That I think is
The thing of
moving.
the passe.
Yes, I think it is now much more active interaction. So directors are wanting Zoom calls like this more often. They are asking the management in terms of sort of what's going on some of the issues that we discussed, and vice versa as well. So both managements and promoters, particularly in companies where they have a certain some element of humility, are actually reaching out to the non-executive directors and using them as a resource and not as the enemy. So, and that is actually working well for them, because many of these directors do come with independent reputations and skill sets. So they are useful as well. This includes nominees of private equity houses as well. So in cases where there are PE investors, the nominee of the PE investor also brings a very interesting skill set, and quite often comparative experience from other businesses as well as globally. For example, as companies are thinking of how do I restart and how do we come out of the lockdown, and what should be the protocol that should be followed, something as elementary as that. So boards are definitely getting involved. It's not just a decision of the management. I think there is a much broader conversation going on. The other conversation we see going on, it may not be very evident at the board level, but it is definitely there in the promoter level. Sometimes spills over into the board as well.
Mr. Shroff, you be a little louder. To be a little
Yeah.
louder, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So the another conversation that is underway is succession planning, which is not just about sort of personal mortality, but I think there's business continuity as well. So
Do you think the succession planning conversation has restarted during this time more because of what is really happening, what was not really there earlier?
it was there earlier, it got accelerated. It has got accelerated, and there are a few companies which I'm aware of where independent directors are even asking the management of where is that white envelope with the name. If something were to happen to the key person, who is going to succeed. So, is there at least is there a white envelope or not? And these are actually really happening. So this is another, and some of this is a bit invisible, but it's there. And another problem that is taking place, depending on the sector, is what are the opportunities for M&A. I think many companies which are actually more liquid and have good balance sheets are kind of licking their chops in terms of what's going to happen 6 months from now, and are they going to get targets at a substantially repriced and a simpler transactions to finish, so that they could use this actually to consolidate their leadership. So this is not, from some of them, it's not just about survival, but it is about widening the gap between them and their competition. So I'll stop here for now at some of the introductory, dipstick of what is happening at boards, and maybe I can have Amita kind of share a little bit of the policy framework under our Companies Act as well, and in terms of how the entire stakeholder model of governance, which was embedded in our system, is now actually coming alive. Amita, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Shrija. Complete pleasure to be here and be part of these conversations that you're hosting for us. The big thing that sir has brought out is the fact that there is no ordinary course of business anymore. I mean, that itself, that concept has sort of gone out of the window, and now every decision that you make is almost it is a major decision of whether it is survival or it is not survival. As of last week, it was reported that there were over 5,000 notifications that have come out from the government on this crisis. I mean, 5,000. So every week, boards have to come together to see whether the plan that they had put in place last week is still valid. Is it still valid in some parts? It's not valid in the other parts. So how do you put together a company policy in that kind of a situation? And that is the reality that they are faced with. And it's actually fabulous because most directors have really stepped up to it. There aren't really complaints. Everybody understands that this is a crucial moment and these are things that we will need to resolve. And the biggest issue that we think that boards are grappling with right now is the fact that unlike any other time in history, this is the first time that they're truly grappling with completely conflicting interests amongst the stakeholders.
Can you perhaps expand on that, please, the conflict of interest in stakeholders?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the big issue that is raging in the international markets now is that there are a number of opinion makers who are coming forward and saying that boards should no longer be making decisions on the basis of what they call shareholder primacy. That is, you make a decision with the intention that you're maximizing profits for the shareholders. So everything that guides the board in how they make their decision is driven by shareholder primacy. What is happening now in the international markets is that people are pushing boards to think wider, to say that this pandemic has shown that creation of wealth outside of societal frameworks is impossible. You will not be able to do it. Therefore, when you make your decisions, you should be actually integrating all of the interests of the relevant stakeholders in order to make that. And it's almost like it sounds very obvious to us, just hearing this, it sounds obvious, but it is a very, very deep-rooted debate that is going on. And I can't say that there is yet a final say on this. I mean, a number of boards are grappling about this world over. India is different. India, back in 2013 itself, has legislated a stakeholder form of governance. So, if you remember the 1956 Act imposed the fiduciary responsibility of directors to be driven by shareholder primacy. So, it was shareholder primacy first, and then through a series of judgments, it sort of evolved to becoming that you had to work in the best interest of the company as a whole. What happened with the 2013 Act is that director duties there was an actual categorization where 5 sets of stakeholders have been identified. They have been placed on par, and the 5 are that you will have to act in the best interests of the company, its members, which is the shareholders, the company's employees, the community, and the protection of the environment. All these 5 are part of how a director needs to make a decision. They need to identify that, okay, how will my decision that I will take now have an impact on each of these stakeholders? If there is any specific adverse impact, is there any way that I can change the decision that I am making? Based on this, I will have to find a balance because there will always be a situation where there may be conflict of interest. I'll give you an example. If I pay out normal salaries to employees, I'm reducing the cash available for profits to shareholders. So, to that extent, it's a direct conflict of interest because every penny I pay to the employee has an impact on what kind of profit I'm going to reduce for the shareholder. And so somewhere you need to be able to bring about a balance. The same thing for environment, it's the same thing for community. There are a number of corporations that have come forward and increased their CSR budgets at this time. They have said that, no, we would like to contribute back to society at this point. So they are, in fact, discharging their duty to community, which is again a statutory responsibility for directors. And this is something that is very unique it is something that directors are aware of, but they never had to actually think about it in the framework that they need to discuss it today. And so
Yeah.
that's what makes this crisis so unique.
Shroff, I think I would sort of come to you to sort of what Amita just mentioned. This entire, ascent of stakeholder capitalism. I'm just going through this entire an interesting piece in Harvard Law Journal, and I want to sort of get your views on this. I would like to directly quote up on the piece, which says that it's an interesting conundrum that companies can and will be valued by investors for being good corporate citizens. But societal pressures for companies to adopt quote unquote stakeholder capitalism could be self defeating if it results in enterprises that are hamstrung in their ability to innovate, grow, and create jobs. So, can you perhaps put that in context of India as to what we are seeing in the ascent of the stakeholder capitalism?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Amita laid out the basic framework for this. And this conversation about stakeholder model of capitalism versus the shareholder model of capitalism has been going on for decades. I mean, there has been a lot of philosophical thinking about this in the West, particularly in Europe, for a very long time. But this whole conversation has accelerated rapidly in the last kind of decade and a half. And India took the big leap, probably that it is finally coming alive. The kind of trade-offs that are required to be made when you're trying to inherently balance interests of five different constituencies, which could be fundamentally in conflict, is happening now. So you can think about 2013, where it was kind of embedded and it was just lying on the shelves, and it is now walking out of the shelves and coming alive in a real context, in sort of real boardrooms. And it is happening not just in isolation in the current context. I think there is also an investor angle to it. So investors such as BlackRock and Larry Fink, who are quite legendary on this theme, and he has been driving this conversation with his annual letter that he sends out, reflecting his thinking, has been, and particularly in the last 3-4 years, he sent out some pretty important communication. So that has been very influential in global boards, and as you know, it always trickles down in India as well. So that the ESG theme and now the EESG theme has its origins actually in the markets now, because markets and investors such as BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street and others who are sort of index fund, and they control such a large proportion of market capitalization. Once they start driving that, once they tell you that you're not going to invest in your company unless you have ESG in your agenda, when you come with a fundraising plan in the market and you say, no, where is your ESG profile? Can we have a look at, can we examine it? When you get into things like integrated reporting, which is sort of driven more by the sort of accountability frameworks. When all these conversations start happening together, so these are like different instruments playing, and then you kind of get a symphony out of that. So there is I think, an ESG symphony that is coming alive from the different instruments that were playing in the past.
A great segue into our next, sort of topic about the ESG discourse that you said is becoming increasingly mainstream in the conversation between the LPs and private equity investors. In fact, I have heard a lot from investors that that LPs are kind of really pushing for having that ESG element. But let me sort of flip that question to you, Mr. Shroff, is that in the entire thing of clean tech investments, for instance, we saw a lot of greenwashing happening. Do you think perhaps this labeling of ESG just for the heck of it to raise capital can also happen from PE side? Perhaps it could be temptations, and how can one avoid some of those temptations?
That's a great question, and there have been many terms that have been used. Greenwashing. I've also heard the word purpose washing as well. So purpose of the corporation is a big theme as well. So sometimes people just tend to pay lip service to it. Now that being said, I think the market is also smart enough, so there's this thing about you can fool some of the people all of the time, you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. So that always eventually you get caught. So I think it's now more than a decade since this theme has been there, and the market has found its value. There are now agencies that actually rate you on. So there's a rating agency that looks at it. There's an Indian proxy advisory service which has also started giving you an ESG score as well. So, I mean, you take first the solidity of the original idea, and then on the market, what it does is it provides checks and balances for this. So, I wouldn't be pessimistic. I think this theme is really here to stay, and this governance conversation. So, every few years we have a major governance conversation going on for the last kind of 2.5 decades. But it's like how Bollywood evolved as well. So the classic Bollywood movie had a good guy and a bad guy, and the story was all about how the good guy finally defeats the bad guy. But if you see the trend of Bollywood movies now, there's no clear villain. So what we're seeing now is governance conversation, which is a villainless conversation, and it is more about really about reflecting what the reality of life is. And the reality of life is that we are a very globally interconnected society and civilization. The reality of just look at it that somebody ate a bat in Wuhan not more than 6 months ago, and see what's happening in every nook and cranny, sort of corner of the world. If that is not proof of interconnectedness, then what is? And this is exactly, I think, even how the governance conversation will evolve. I'm not comparing it to a virus, but I think that's how thinking will, the stream of thoughts will flow as well.
So beautifully put. In the world of interconnectedness, there's a villainless kind of, corporate governance conversation we are dealing with. Amita, I sort of come to you as to sort of what Mr. Shroff left with. This entire attitude of wrongful trading, but that also sort of comes into picture because he mentioned that, in the earlier conversation, at least you had one bad guy to pin the blame on. But we are dealing with a new and different world and new realities. So how does one sort of solve for some of those equations then?
So that's the thing, Shrija, that there is so many unknowns in what we're looking at now. You don't even know how long this will last. As compared to any other crisis, you're dealing with a situation where an event has already occurred. It is a one-time event, a plane has crashed, whatever it is. There is a very specific event on the basis of which a crisis develops, and it's us. You're sort of managing the crisis with the main event having occurred already having occurred. What we're dealing with now is that we don't even know whether the major part of the crisis has yet struck us. I mean, we're waiting to see what will happen, and every day, of course, there are as many optimists as there are pessimists in the news, so you don't really know where this is going to end. What that actually raises for directors is things like personal liability that may be attached to decisions that you make in the unknown as it stands today. One of them is that the IBC has a concept where personal liability can be resulted on directors if they defraud a creditor. That is, they take on a loan knowing that they will not be able to pay the creditor. That essentially means that you should have some amount of diligence that has gotten you convinced that you will be able to pay off this loan at the time that you were taking it. In a situation where you don't know when business will restart, you don't know what kind of market you will go back into, you don't know when revenues will actually start coming back in, how do you make that determination? But what you're effectively trying to do is to manage the cash for which you're getting all of these loans that are being confirmed by the government or backstopped by the government. But even within that, there is this concept that if there is no clarity as to whether you go out and take a loan right now, will it result in you having, when somebody is wearing a retrospective lens, 7 months later, that the company has gone completely downhill because many more things have happened in the meantime. Could you have made this determination in advance? So it's not a clear world. It's like driving up it's what they say for macroeconomics. It's like you're driving up a hill where you only have the rearview mirror to guide you. Your windshield is completely covered, and that is the kind of space in which directors are making decisions right now.
Interesting. Mr. Shroff, I come to you. I think you spoke about the ESG disclosures and perhaps people are becoming smart. Purpose washing or greenwashing is perhaps not that happening. So, Mr. Shroff, I want to talk to you about that. So, what remains the future of the corporation? Throw some light there. How should CEOs think about laying out what is the future of the enterprise that they're building on? The pandemic has shown that there's a huge interconnected between, the human capital and the value of the enterprise that you're building for the corporation in that regard. What is your message to, the Tatas or Birlas or Ambanis who are building out the organization? Because things have really changed since then. You're on mute, Mr. Shroff.
Sorry, that's a great question. And first, a short answer to your question: does the corporation have a future? Absolutely. I think the sort of joint stock corporation has been one of the greatest inventions ever made by humanity. So I think that that fundamental idea still remains, but it has evolved and it will evolve a lot more. A lot more. It will evolve by now converting kind of selfish capitalism in a shareholder model to this broader model. I think purpose will become even more important. And I think there will be a broader impact in terms of how corporations react to how the economy is changing. Look at some of the things that are happening. I think we're seeing deglobalization. I think one more impact we're going to see out of this, which is rise of work from home, is a dramatic increase in the gig economy. How are you going to have governance in a gig economy where your workforce is a distributed workforce and is not in a pyramid model, which is basically the military model of governance, where you have a commander in chief and then you have different layers. And so that has been our default mindset in the past. But what the internet, the sort of latest pandemic and the ability that we are all working, there's not one office now. My office now has 750 offices, which is what has happened. How do you think of governance in that part? And this is happening to corporations as well. So the default design in the mind of businesses in terms of what will be that model of governance will fundamentally change, and it's going to democratize it even more. The social contract between the customer, the enterprise, and the employee, all of that is going to be rewritten. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. I think I would see it as an incredible opportunity for humanity to evolve rather than as a threat. So I think the corporation will remain, it will be redesigned. I think we're going to see new design ideas coming in, and we are probably at the first 1% of that evolution. Give it, I think, going to see in the next decade the entire sort of market structure, the way we think of corporations, will dissolve. Humanity has, I think, been spoiled a bit in the past because they always thought there's a crisis, we go back to the old default. SARS happened, okay, 1 year there was a disruption, back to normal. 9/11 happened, yeah, we went back to normal. Global finance crisis happened, we went back to normal. In fact, we did better than before. This one, I think, is different because this one is more universal. I think it's kind of changed certain fundamental assumptions, but it is also pregnant with the greatest opportunity that we have. So, I just hope that we all kind of survive and are there to see that new tomorrow. But it's an exciting one. So, and I think big changes in governance have to come because how nations deal with each other will change, how businesses deal with society will change. I can think of even on governance, probably will it mean that we will change the structure of the board? Today's board structure is a reflection of the shareholder model of governance. Who's on the board? People who shareholders appoint. But we started talking about the stakeholder model of governance. If the board is a microcosm of interests that are represented by a corporation, one of the changes I think we should expect is that the board itself will become reflective of the stakeholder model of governance, which it isn't today. And that very idea is so profound in terms of its secondary implications, in terms of what will it mean to ownership, what will it mean to accountability. So all these changes will come. And this is going to be a conversation, as I said, we're in the first 1% of that journey.
So we are really talking about a paradigm shift in how we look at the meaning and the future of corporations, and also what you just mentioned, that if the board is really the microcosm of the interest of all these stakeholders, it perhaps needs to go beyond just the shareholders. I come to you now, Amitabh, and I think it becomes it's a great segment, the third part of our conversation, really, the major shifts in governance that we can see in the next decade, that 2020. I mean, 2020 has been a defining year, really, on various counts. I mean, it's a year which one would like to forget, but has having fundamental shift on various things. In that context, perhaps give us, some segment to 3 or 4 large ideas or trends that you see where we go from when we talk about the governance perspective at large.
Sure. So maybe I'll just do one, and then maybe Mr. Shroff and I can throw it in together because we've sort of thought through some different types of things. Just as a continuation, of the purpose conversation that we've been having around what is the future of corporation. Colin Mayer's entire focus has been to sort of say that you need to rethink that the idea of the corporation is not to be able to produce profits, but actually to produce solutions. So if you sort of break up the problems of the world into various categories, and the focus of the conversation of the corporation will then become how close am I to getting to a solution of whatever is the problem that humanity has identified, that is what will drive progress in a much more holistic manner. And the issue of identifying those problems has also already been done. So the UN has set out these sustainable development goals that they have identified 17 categories of problems that have been identified. And unless we are able to align corporations with actually getting to that, governments themselves will not be able to achieve those goals. And I think that is the mindset shift that needs to happen very fundamentally. That as a society which includes how capital sort of runs through. So Vanguard is actually running pension fund money. So there are ordinary citizens who go out and work, put their money into pension funds, which then put out their money into these big, massive investment houses like BlackRock and Vanguard, etc. So money is actually very cyclical, and the idea is to get to that point where there is pressure at all levels to make this fundamental shift, and that is something that will necessarily happen. The other big shift that we will see is more peculiar to India, not so much the world, because in the world this has already been an established concept, is that of class action. India has not seen governance become a mainstream conversation except for the high profile matters where it takes up the front page of most of the big papers for a while, unless it's a very high profile company. In all other situations, governance is a byline that they sort of say, okay, if SEBI asks us some questions, we'll see how to deal with it. But once the class action regime got notified in June last year, we ourselves see that companies are willing to sit up and take notice. They know that now the risk is real. It is not, people have heard of the famous class actions where decisions of the board result in millions and millions of dollars being given as compensation through a class action mechanism. And that is something that we will see change the way boards discharge their obligations today. I'll give you a simple example. We've talked about stakeholder model of governance. We've talked about how they have to be trade-offs. Normally it would be, everybody internalizes those trade-offs and comes to a decision. Today, because of the fear of class actions, there is a lot more deliberate discussion that is happening. There is a lot of actual recording of the discussion, because in the event this entire issue is reopened in 5 years from now through a class action, there is actually a record of how that conversation happened. Directors have some defenses that they're inbuilding into their decision making process today so that they will be able to defend it later. These are very, very hard decisions that people are taking, but it is changing board conduct. So,
no, I sort of quite agree with that. So there are two things. One is the class action threat, and we're just one judicial innovation away from that becoming reality. But the entire framework is there. Somebody has to just put the switch on. But the equipment, the legal equipment is all in place. So that's on the class actions. If Indian companies are accessing US or Western capital, I think they need to realize that it comes as a package. And one of the things that comes as a package is this variety or this brand of accountable capitalism, and accountability in the West happens to the judicial system, namely class actions. This was the piece that was sort of missing in the past. You can't cherry pick and say, I just like your money, but by the way, I'm not going to be accountable for it in the same sense that you're used to in other markets of the world. And that, I think, is one change that will happen. It has to come. It's a whole package. You can't cherry. The second one, which I think we started developing in the first part of the conversation but didn't complete, is that of big data, where with technology, big data, and greater access to technology tools, that the market will find its own way of governance. You can't lie to the market or just put out some shabby disclosure and expect that people will swallow that. If that, you can't lie to the people all of the time. You can't fool all the people all of the time. It's important. And big data will catch you. So you can't put out a disclosure which would say my company is doing great, my sales are so and so, I've got so much market share. Somewhere when you say that, some red light will go up in some on somebody's computer in the regulator's office who's using AI-based big data tool, which will say, "Hey, this is a lie," and then you run into a sort of problem. And these tools already exist, and the regulators already have it. This is not science fiction. This is today's reality. You're on mute, Sri.
Mr. Shroff, why question capitalism now? Is the question to ask. Is the basic premise on which corporations are founded. We're talking about responsible capitalism here. So are we also suggesting that the modes of investing, like impact investing, is going to become more mainstream? Is that a great sort of takeaway from this? We have seen that large shareholders in the US coming into the agreement and signing a pact that we will only do what is responsible capitalism. So basically, we're questioning capitalism now.
Okay, so if I've been misunderstood to mean that I'm a socialist, I'm not. I am a capitalist at heart because I think capitalism is a very purifying concept. But I think what we're talking about is capitalism 2.0, which is responsible capitalism, as opposed to selfish capitalism. Because selfish capitalism creates too many inequalities, whereas responsible capitalism is a kind of capitalism with a dose of philosophy attached. And when you combine these two, then you sort of get a better outcome. So we're not talking about rejecting capitalism. We're not talking about rejecting the concept of a joint stock company. I think we need to retain both because it does manage to innovate for society. It provides solutions. What Amita mentioned is that the original idea of a corporation was to find solutions. And that's what gave it the social license to operate. I mean, all organizations, including yours and mine, need a social license to operate. And that social license to operate comes from what are you trying to solve for? I'm trying to solve for access to justice, and you're trying to solve for truth. So what everybody has a social purpose and a social license to operate. So corporations need to go back to that original idea of examining what is it that they're there for, and so long as they can combine their purpose with that. With their actions, with their purpose, they will create very profitable businesses, and I think will also do justice to their social license to operate.
So I would actually.
I'm not questioning capitalism at all. In fact, I think it's a wonderful idea. It has created prosperity for thousands and millions of people, but it needs to move to the next stage. Amita?
You were saying something, Amita.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, the idea that investors are going only towards impact investing in the sense of responsible capitalism, there are two types. One is where they invest only after they know that you are in the zone of impact investing. But the more common function is actually where they invest, but they take their stewardship role as an investor very seriously and guide the corporation towards more sort of wholesome, socially relevant solution finding, not just profit related drivers. So that is a different way. You're being responsible as an investor. You're not sort of coming into the annual meeting and saying, "Is bar profit itna kyun low hai?" You're actually walking into the annual report and at the annual meeting and saying your business sustainability report does not address these 5 areas that are crucial to the entire sort of both to community as well as to environment, and that is what will drive responsible capital.
Okay, I think we spoke about, it's a very interesting and meaningful conversation, unraveling so many deep insights. I also want to sort of talk about, Mr. Shroff, how do the equations change perhaps for gig economy? And that's a very interesting and an important growing economy that we have, the gig economy. We spoke about perhaps the large corporations and the more established ones and how the purpose in the future could change. Please, if you can throw some light and color on the gig economy aspect.
So, short answer is I don't know, because it's still very early days of the sort of gigification of our economy. But I think it's going to impact every organization. Given the, we are today talking about work from home. It's soon going to be work from village. And you have those kind of developments as well. Because what we've done is, what this crisis has done is, fundamentally challenge the office centricity of the work model. Which doesn't mean that offices will not exist. Of course, I think they will. but it will be a mix and match. So you will have two cultures. One will be office culture, and then the sort of the secondary culture, which could be work from home, work from village, or complete gig. And the rules will be very different. What are the rules in relation to accountability? How do you today, at least say, for example, in a service industry like ours, a lot of what we do and also what we get paid for is input. I think the model of how people are employed and compensated will change to output. I don't care. I mean, it might lead to I don't care whether you work 6 hours or 8 hours. Have you delivered what I asked you to or not? I'm not going to compensate you on 8 hours of your time. I'm going to compensate you on did you produce X, which is what was expected from you. These are very fundamental changes because then you are measuring output, not input. Your measurement of quality will be very different. The new metric of quality would be have you produced a zero defect document? So every defect you get is you get minus point. We just take some random example there. So the culture of work in the office-centric environment and the non-office-centric environment will have some similarities because they're loyal to the same corporation, but the rules of engagement will be very different. And this has kind of yet to be invented. There will be technology and cyber-related issues, confidentiality issues, ethical issues, mental health issues as well. You know, we know in the past when we say we sort of brought office back home, it was just kind of a weekend thing, or you had to sign some document or read a piece of paper 1 or 2 hours at home. Now the whole office has come home. It's fundamentally different, and what happens there when you do that is a part of the home gets pushed to the side. What social implications that will have on a long-term basis, I don't know. So, headline answer, I don't know, but I can see hundreds of issues arising from this, all of which are solvable, but people will have to think through this.
So there's one other big change that will happen through the gig economy on corporate culture, which is a big part of the conversation that governance actually drives, which is the fact that the gig economy will allow for a number of women to come into the workforce who are otherwise not at all able to access the office environment, and that is going to fundamentally change how you think of work product, how you think of work. You know what kind of work can be done by who, and that will change a lot of things across the board.
At least I'm not worried about that because we are majority women, so I think we are doing great on that.
No, now we will be more super majority women.
We need to have reservations for men.
That's a different kind of problem you're dealing with here.
Yeah.
You know,
But it will also
about,
bring in, I think just because I think the way, the kind of skills and the kind of EQ that women may bring to the work culture and workforce will be very interesting. It will definitely add a certain creativity. I think I don't think men are not creative, but I think it will certainly bring a different dimension to how organizations are designed.
That's interesting. Now we sort of spoke about the positive, perhaps spin-offs or takeaways from the gig economy. Also, Amit, I want to talk to you specifically about this entire conversation on director liability and D&O insurance. In the context of governance, can you perhaps throw some light on that?
Sure. So this is again another thing that everybody is sort of concerned about. Director liability lagega, but we've not really had any actual cases where directors have had to go out of pocket or where there was an actual monetary consequence to being on the board. Yes, there are some embarrassment, there is some loss of reputation and that kind of cost to being on the board and not discharging your duty, but the monetary implications have not yet hit India. This decade is going to see that change. This decade is going to see that directors will actually have a cost for not actually doing their duty. That cost is going to be substantial. So that is actually going to drive a lot more focus on to how D&O insurance is going to become a mainstream product on the financial side. We actually did this study last year, and as of last year, we'd spoken to the top 5 companies that provide D&O insurance, and not a single one of them had actually had a situation where a D&O insurance was called. So it's like free premium for them. So they don't even actually address what kind of risk there is. How they price that risk is also so feeble and so basic and fundamental. It is not really looking at, does it have a strong governance structure? Is there a chance of a payout? So all of those is something that the Indian markets are going to see innovations on. Not unique to the world. The world, places like America and Europe have very, very sophisticated D&O insurance products. It's just not something that has come to India yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's one, if I can add, I think
Sure.
a lot of these mandates have been prescriptive and have come from the regulator. Whenever there is some kind of behavioral expectation, you have a schedule in the company that 5 pages about the director will do. We actually have a 5-page schedule in the Companies Act on what independent directors, but actually no human being can comply. I call it the kind of the Gandhi annexure, because only Gandhiji could, and sometimes not sure even he could comply with that. Then you have SEBI, which will lay down lots of rules. The difference in what Amita was pointing out is that this is going to come from the judiciary. It is going forward, and this is what happened in the West. Nobody in the West, the boards are worried about what will happen if they get sued in a class, like what the jury will decide as the damages. Yeah, of course they worry about what SEC thinks, but they're far more worried about what will happen if they get sued. That is what drives behavior.
These are like very, meaningful revelations. And I want us to go back to Mr. Shaw, what you just said, that, this entire thing of a villainless crime, and we are sort of playing with that unknown. So do you think the pandemic will unearth major governance issues in corporations? We have seen some case of frauds in public companies, the very famous being the Satyam prices, but they were more different, they were more financial kind of frauds. Can there be new kind of frauds or governance crisis, which the pandemic can unearth? And is it
So
really
the moment you start with fraud, I mean, we are assuming there's a villain there. So that's still playing out the old playbook of there's a bad guy and the good guy. I think the difference in the current price, the governance price, which I call the villainless one, is how do you prepare for a new tomorrow which has yet to be imagined, where all the plates are moving, and you're trying to. It's like a 8-dimensional matrix where every part is moving, and you're trying to design for that and make sure that you not only make the right business decision, but you also make the right ethical decision. So I think the ethics, is going to be a big part of how this future governance conversation goes.
how should startups maneuver
For
this?
example, technology and the whole ethics of technology or the ethics of artificial intelligence. How are you going to design ethical technology? If the next 10 years is the decade that belongs to technology, there's a hell of a lot of ethics that has to be built into technology as well. Now that's what I call the villainless, the kind of villainless governance problem.
Mr. Shaw, you spoke
Then we
about
ourselves are the villain because we made wrong design decisions.
That's an interesting way to put it. And we spoke about, how corporations are redefining. There'll be new ideas coming on, the future of corporation. I know a lot of investment is coming into the so-called, nimble-footed, agile business models, primarily driven by tech and also run by young entrepreneurs. One has not necessarily seen a lot of, such. You say that, in terms of corporate governance standards, there seem to be gray areas, on how the word is not really out. What would be your advice to startups then?
I would ask Amita to take that question.
I think startups.
Advice to startup.
Yeah, I think startups are the ones that are actually going to face what we're talking about. That is, next generation governance, where it's a very flat. Most startups, their big focus is the fact that they're very flat organizations. So they don't have command and control sort of approach. That a significant portion of what they're trying to do is done through collaboration, not so much actually doing it through the within the same company that you collaborate across different. So the ownership of IP is a very complicated space that comes out, and therefore valuations are also very, very different drivers. the biggest governance fights that are happening today, not in 2.0, which we think will change, but even just today, the fact that when you start with Series A and then you go all the way to Series B or Series A, you sort of renegotiated that shareholders agreement so many times. So there are layers and layers and layers of governance rights that are embedded across different types of and that makes for very very complicated outcomes, and that becomes a problem in two situations. One of in a situation where you don't have cash, there isn't really that much of an outcome because there's nothing really to fight about. And if you're very successful, also that's not something that is going to do. But if you're at that survival space where you have just enough to survive, that is when the governance fights at the company level become really, really prevalent, and that is where getting in space, getting into a space where you have been building up a governance culture throughout, so that you can actually handle that survival space. It actually is the way you will go past that post.
So that's a piece of advice going on to startups, building a governance culture, especially on a startup mode. Please, Mr. Shaw. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think it's an interesting point where I think I should raise the topic of role of a promoter. So the traditional model of a role of a promoter is that he's got a controlling interest, usually about 51%, is a sort of gata of the business, and he will drive the future. And a lot of our corporate and governance thinking has been based on that premise. And the accountability and the liability framework also proceeds on that. If something goes wrong in the company, promoter ko pakdo. If you want to list a company, you can't file an offer document without the photograph and the passport and driving license of the promoter. So there is a kind of a disproportionate, almost godlike kind of existence which the promoter has in our corporate imagination. Of the kind of influence they have, as well as the accountability. Ultimately, the buck stops there. So now go to since we're talking about startups, and to quote Amita's example, by the time you are at Series H, the promoter has come down to single digits, but he's still carrying that responsibility. So why would you hold a 9% fellow or a 10% or even a 15% fellow accountable in the same way that you hold a 51% guy? So
it's a very important question to ask.
Shades of
we are seeing this play out. Yeah,
we're seeing this play out, and they can't do anything. And then the investors who are now holding that balance 85 or 90%, they are concerned with only one thing. Whereas that long-termism which that promoter has, but who has now lost the ability to drive the destiny of the company, because he's at the mercy of the balance, and he's also at the mercy of agreements that he never even read when he signed them. Because that stage, all that he wants is, where do I sign? Where's the check?
Yeah. I think we covered the whole gamut of things. This has been a very meaningful conversations around corporate governance. And Mr. Shroff, I would like to sort of also ask you, did you perhaps manage to meet your grandchildren yet? We are entering the first phase of unlock now. From our last conversation.
I'll be having those movies coming soon. I'm at that stage now.
Okay, my trivia question to you is that the last time you actually sort of labeled the entire IBC phenomenon as a famous Ajit Kumar joke. If you were to give me a joke today, what would that be?
We are missing the cashew nuts.
That is really going to the board directors. And if you were to give me one advice from one corporate interaction that you had with one CEO which really stuck with you for long and perhaps is reminiscent to you in these times of the difficult times of governance, what is that one conversation? Give us some color or banter there.
Obviously, sort of without names, but I think some of the most meaningful conversations I've had with directors or promoters is where they've been able to sort of imagine a world 10, 15 years down the line which has got nothing to do with the sort of present, and also design a kind of a governance framework to support that. So I've had some of those conversations, and those are the ones that really stick with me of brilliant entrepreneurs in the country who are able to think generations ahead. So those are the and they're actually, they may sound more profit oriented, but they actually make a deep impact on society.
Interesting. Amit, I come to you now. How is it about doing deal making in virtual environment? Is it the new normal for you?
Yeah, it is very much the new normal. But like I said, the clients expect that you're really available 24/7. We were already a firm where we were available to clients 24/7, and now it has just become that to us.
Okay.
I am very thankful that we have the ability to be in a space where we can continue to work something like this. I'm very grateful for that.
Sure. I think we have some questions from the audiences also. I think we should do justice to that. There is one question, I think, Mr. Shaw, maybe you can take a stab at this. How role of Office of Independent Director will and should shape up going forward? That's a question from Ashok Maheshwari.
Yeah, I'll take it and I'll get Amita to also add to it.
Sure.
So that role is already changing. It's as I said in my introductory remarks, I told non-executive that N is dropping off, and at least through this crisis, the independent directors are far more engaged, and they want to offer their services also to the management to help them navigate out of the crisis. At the back of the mind, there may be liability issues, but what is driving most of them actually is the desire to make sure that they do the right thing. So I've seen that change, and it's of course it is individual driven. Not everybody is in the same boat, but as a general principle, independent directors are far more involved in guiding their companies through this crisis. Amita,
I would just add that, I think there was a period maybe over the last 10 years where we were seeing an exodus of good independent directors out of the market. The one thing that we are sort of hearing in the market right now is a re-entry. A lot of high caliber senior professionals think that this might be their contribution back to society and are thinking of actually taking on independent director roles given the expanded role that they will be taking and their contribution back to society. It is a very impactful role for them to take on. So we might see a reversal of the exodus we've seen in the last decade.
Okay.
There's one more reason for that. One is, of course, kind of self-realization that they should contribute. But I think the attitude of companies towards them is also changing. They're more welcoming.
Okay. There's one more question, Shroff. What is the status of litigation funding in India? Have any Indian entities raised litigation funding in India or abroad?
Amita, you take this one. I mean, this is a long topic in probably 2 sessions.
Yeah, it's a long topic, but actually litigation funding in countries like Australia went hand in hand with the whole class action regime. So that is something that we are watching closely. We do think that litigation funding will come even in India hand in hand with the class action regime as and when it starts later on in this decade. As on date, a classic litigation funding is not something that India or big Indian corporates have seen. Yes, some muqadmas have been sold and bought in various informal sector assessments, but not really in the company space. In the EPC space, we are seeing companies actually figure out ways to leverage capital on pending claims. They're not doing it through the standard litigation funding models. They actually move the claim into a separate company and raise funding there. But it's all work in progress. Again, something that we will see happen in quite a big way this coming decade.
Okay, this one
more
more
question. I think contrary to popular perception, it's not illegal in India. I mean, people think it's sympathy, but there are many sort of zones in litigation funding where it is possible to do. Arbitration is one area where it would be feasible.
Okay, there's one more question. Will India also adopt senior NED principles as the UK markets have?
Amita?
It's possible, but I don't really think. I think the way we're sort of moving towards is what Mr. Shroff said, is to drop the whole N part of how we are thinking of our directors engaging on the board. That everybody is in it together and that we will get through this together, and that is probably going to be a bigger driver. As of now, I don't think the government is going to, or regulator is going to make any material changes on roles and responsibilities of directors for the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. There's one more question. I think it's a pretty pointed kind of question. I think it's for you, Amita. In India, which is a promoter-driven and controlled companies, how independent are the directors really? Even if they are high-caliber professionals, shouldn't the law also have some protection for the IDs too? Amita's foreboding warning that this is a decade for directors to be careful needs to be reviewed in this light. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the government is trying hard to bring in sort of safeguards and protections for independent directors. So there have been circulars that have been issued saying that don't go out and try and attack independent directors or put them into sort of regulatory jam unless there is specific evidence against them. Those safeguards will evolve. But like I said, the jurisprudence around this is yet to evolve. As and when we see cases come up during the course of this decade, we will see that a lot of these things become much clearer. Right now, we're playing in gray space.
Mr. Shroff, there's one question for you. Do you think any amendments expected in Companies Act?
But what does that question mean?
I don't know. I mean, it's a question that you
Amendment for what?
For the Companies Act expected.
So they're always amending something or the other. So I specifically on this conversation, I don't think so. In fact, just now it's been softened. As you know, that whole decriminalization thing has happened. So which is a good thing because I think it has gone too far. But I think the real innovation that will come is, I think the next is going to be a judicial innovation.
Okay. There's one
Not a
question.
legislative one.
There's one question from Narayan Shankar that if you drop the N from NED, aren't they crossing the LOC and becoming more liable, as it is no longer going to be knowledge attributable through board process?
Yes, but I think I just want to explain the context of my observation, and I think the dropping of the N is not as a matter of form, it is a matter of the practical reality that just now, even though they are non-executive and legally and statutorily they are non-executive, but they are more engaged. So it's probably NED now become engaged non-executive directors.
I think we'll just take one last question. I think that will be a great wrap up to this meaningful conversation. I think it's a light question. I think we've already touched upon this. How will life change for investor and nominee directors?
How will life change for investor nominee directors? I think on a lighter note, I think we'll have to work harder.
Okay, so that's a good end for this conversation. Until the time we see you next, goodbye and good luck. Thank you for being patient, audience, and thank you, Mr. Shroff and Amita, for joining us. And we'll see you goodbye and good luck for the next episode. Till then, please
see you next Saturday.
See you next Saturday, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.